quiet of the hidden leaf village, beneath the soft rustle of trees lining the paths and the distant hum of cicadas under a hazy sun, there lived a boy whose energy never ceased and whose spirit burned like a small, flickering flame struggling against the wind. His name was Might Guy, before he was the legendary taijutsu master who would one day challenge fate itself with nothing but muscle, willpower, and fiery determination. He was simply the son of a man whom others laughed at and dismissed. A man named Might Dewey. They called Dewey the Eternal Genin, a shinobi who wore his green jumpsuit like a badge of honor and whose toothy smile never wavered, even as others sneered. But to Guy, his father was the greatest man alive. Guy's childhood was not marked by academic brilliance or promising jutsu aptitude. While other students in the academy manipulated chakra with ease and showed early signs of genius, Guy struggled. Ninjutsu eluded him. Genjutsu made no sense to him. The frustration of trying and failing again and again could have broken him. But instead, it forged something else within him. His father's words, simple yet full of conviction, echoed in his mind whenever he felt weak. A dropout can defeat a genius through hard work. Guy believed it, even when the evidence was scarce. His body moved before his doubts could take root. He trained before sunrise and long after the village fell quiet, pushing himself to the brink in pursuit of something others thought impossible. In those early years, Guy was surrounded by peers who didn't know what to make of him. His loud declarations of youth, his odd green jumpsuit, and his insistence on challenges that involved thousands of push-ups made him seem foolish. Yet, beneath the surface, he was building something invisible, a foundation of discipline and strength that required no chakra, no tricks, only time and heart. Among those who noticed was a boy named Kakashi Hatake, already being called a prodigy. The two could not have been more different. Kakashi was quiet, precise, and serious. Guy was loud, erratic, and emotionally transparent. But fate had a way of weaving their stories together in curious knots. Guy made it his mission to surpass Kakashi, not out of hatred or jealousy, but as a goal to aim for, a symbol of everything he wasn't, but wanted to prove he could stand beside. Every time he lost, he recorded it. Every time he came close, he pushed harder. Kakashi rarely acknowledged Guy's rivalry, with much more than a bemused glance. But it didn't matter. Guy knew that to him, these challenges were sacred. They were proof that he could keep going, that he could grow stronger. His father remained his guiding star. Might Dewey trained in secret, away from the sneering eyes of the village. Unknown to most, Dewey had spent decades mastering the 8 inner gates, a forbidden taijutsu technique that unleashed overwhelming power at the cost of terrible damage to the body. Dewey never used it, holding on to the power not for glory, but for the moment it would be truly needed. That moment came one fateful night when Guy and his team were cornered by the infamous 7 ninja swordsmen of the mist. Outmatched and overwhelmed, it was Dewey who appeared to defend them. With the power of the 8 gates, he fought them all, sacrificing his life to save his son. That night left Guy with grief so deep it carved a permanent space in his heart. But it also gave him something else, a mission. He would honor his father's sacrifice by becoming strong enough to protect others with his own body, to live a life of courage, and to never waver. As the years passed, Guy rose through the ranks, still mocked at times, still underestimated. But those who sparred with him knew better. His punches struck like thunder. His kicks sent shock waves through stone. And above all, his spirit, burning, unshakable, was what truly set him apart. He became a Jonin and took on a team of his own. Among his students was a boy named Rock Lee, who, like Guy, could not use ninjutsu or genjutsu. The two bonded instantly, not just as teacher and student, but as kindred spirits. Guy became to Lee what Dewey had been to him, a beacon of what was possible through effort alone. With time, even Kakashi came to respect Guy in his own quiet way. Though their approaches to life were vastly different, Guy's unrelenting dedication left an impression. They continued their rivalry well into adulthood, challenging each other to races around the village, absurd push-up contests, and silent contests of spirit. Behind their humor was a deep, unspoken bond, the kind that grows not through words, but through the steady rhythm of shared history. When war loomed and chaos began to spread across the shinobi world, Guy did not falter. He stood on the front lines, always charging forward, always giving everything. His belief in the power of youth became a source of strength, not only for himself and his students, but for those around him who found themselves drained by the weight of endless fighting. He reminded them, through action, not words, that willpower could defy the impossible. But even as his legend grew, Guy remained grounded. He never forgot his father's smile. He never stopped wearing the green jumpsuit. He never lost the warmth in his voice, the flare in his eyes, the joy he found in a sunrise jog or a friendly duel. His strength, after all, was never just in his fists. It was in his heart. The world outside the hidden leaf often failed to notice the quiet giants that walked among the loudest legends. As the years drifted on, like cherry blossoms in spring, Might Guy stood not in the shadow of greatness, but just beside it, always present, always enduring, like a quiet drumbeat beneath the song of war and peace. Though he had never mastered ninjutsu or genjutsu, Guy's presence among Konoha's elite was never questioned by those who had truly seen him in action. His path was one of fists and feet, but also of unshakable resolve and profound compassion. Within his squad, Guy nurtured a bond with Rock Lee that only deepened with time. He did not merely teach Lee how to fight. He taught him how to believe. Like a gardener tending a fragile sapling, Guy poured all of his hopes into Lee, encouraging him to bloom despite the storm of expectations and limitations that constantly threatened to uproot him. Their training sessions were long, intense, often absurd, and always filled with purpose. 1,000 punches under a waterfall, 2,000 kicks on a cliffside, races through forests, sprints across rivers, handstands atop narrow poles swaying in the breeze. Their days were spent not in comfortable classrooms, but in the crucible of effort. Guy never pushed Lee out of cruelty or pressure. He pushed him because he had walked that road himself, barefoot and bruised, carrying the echo of his father's belief in him. And now he passed that same belief on. For Lee, every moment beside Guy was a moment of learning, not just about taijutsu, but about living with mice in your heart, even when the world offers you no fuel to burn. In this way, Guy became more than a teacher. He became a living embodiment of the idea that destiny could be rewritten through sheer will. Among the other members of his team, Guy's influence was just as steady. Neji Hyuga, born into the rigid traditions of a clan that believed in fate and hierarchy, initially struggled to understand Guy's philosophies. Neji had been taught that destiny was unchangeable, that those born into power remained powerful, and those without it must simply accept their place. But under Guy's tutelage, and through Lee's ceaseless effort, Neji saw something he hadn't expected: the power of choice. It was not lectures or arguments that changed Neji's heart. It was the quiet example Guy set, day after day, year after year, with his unwavering belief in human potential. Tenten, their third teammate, admired Guy's boundless energy, even if she didn't always show it. His unique way of blending discipline with passion influenced her own path as a weapons specialist. Though Guy was loud and eccentric, often bursting into exaggerated tears or erupting into joyous laughter, Tenten saw the seriousness behind it. She understood that his theatrics masked a deep sense of duty. And in time, she came to appreciate his presence as the glue that held their unusual team together. Outside of Team Guy, his presence continued to ripple. He remained an unorthodox rival to Kakashi, whose cool demeanor and genius-level ability contrasted starkly with Guy's blazing personality. Yet, the rivalry matured like wine, becoming less about competition and more about camaraderie. Their daily contests, who could eat the most hot curry, who could run the most laps around the village, who could do the most handstands, were the stuff of legend. But behind the banter was something deeper: trust. Kakashi never said it outright, but he respected Guy more than most. He understood that Guy's strength came not from talent, but from an indomitable soul that refused to yield. When missions called Guy away from the village, he carried his spirit with him into the world. Whether fighting rogue ninja or defending villages threatened by war, Guy faced every danger, with his usual exuberance. He saw battle as another form of training, another test of his ability to protect. But he never lost sight of the preciousness of life. He did not fight to destroy. He fought to preserve. One of his most famous missions came during the events surrounding the Akatsuki. As their dark influence spread across the shinobi world, Guy found himself increasingly entangled in greater conflicts. He clashed with Kisame Hoshigaki of the 7 ninja swordsmen more than once. Their rivalry was not unlike Guy's with Kakashi, but it was far more deadly. Kisame was brutal and cunning, and yet even he came to acknowledge the force that was Might Guy. In one of their later encounters, Guy defeated Kisame using the 7th gate of the 8 inner gates technique, releasing a torrent of blue flames that roared like a dragon and shattered the landscape. It was a display of terrifying beauty, raw, pure power channeled through a body honed to its absolute limits. But even then, Guy did not revel in victory. He mourned Kisame's resolve, even as he respected it. Guy understood that even enemies had their stories, and he always approached battle with a strange sense of reverence. Every fight was sacred to him, an opportunity to prove that heart could match strength. As his reputation grew, so did the weight he bore. Guy never sought fame, but it came to him nonetheless. Younger shinobi looked to him with awe. Villagers bowed as he passed. Yet, in his eyes, he was still just the boy who once couldn't mold chakra, who wore the same green jumpsuit his father wore, and who remembered Might Dewey's sacrifice every morning as he ran laps around the village under the rising sun. In quiet moments, Guy often stood atop the Hokage monument, wind tugging at his spiky hair, eyes fixed on the horizon. He didn't think of glory or titles. He thought of how far he'd come. He thought of Lee's progress, of Kakashi's quiet approval, of his own failures and how they had shaped him. And sometimes, when no one was watching, he would whisper a thank you to his father, the man who had believed in him before anyone else ever did. Because Might Guy was not built in a day. He was sculpted from years of laughter and loss, trial and triumph, failure and fire. And as the world around him changed and chaos threatened to rise, the man in green remained, a living reminder that the strongest force in the world might just be the unshakable belief that hard work, heart, and youthful spirit could overcome anything. As the seasons changed and Konoha rebuilt itself from conflict after conflict, Might Guy remained a constant presence, a green flame that refused to flicker out no matter how hard the wind blew. He was there when the village trembled in the wake of the sand and sound invasion. He was there when the Akatsuki began to stir from the shadows, and when trust between the villages began to fracture. And through it all, Guy did not change. He trained. He taught. He smiled. But something else was changing, silently and gradually. Time. His students were growing up, Lee no longer needed to be reminded to do 500 kicks at sunrise. Neji no longer looked at the world as a place divided by destiny and walls. Tenten, too, had sharpened her craft to the point that she no longer second-guessed herself. Guy watched all this with pride swelling behind his teeth, but also with a quiet melancholy that lingered beneath the surface. He knew, deep down, that youth was not forever. It was a spark, not a flame, and even his could not burn eternally. Still, he poured himself into every mission. His team had become one of the most formidable in Konoha. Where others relied on flashy ninjutsu or clever illusions, Team Guy carved their path with physicality, with sweat and muscle and heart. When the call came to aid in the retrieval of Sasuke Uchiha, now a rogue shinobi walking a dark and dangerous path, Guy's team was called to back up Kakashi. Lee was ready. Neji was resolute. And Guy, ever the protector, moved with the fierce clarity of someone who had never once doubted his students. They clashed with formidable foes during the mission. And though they succeeded in turning the tide, the toll was felt. Neji was pushed to the brink. Lee, still recovering from a surgery that had almost ended his career, pushed himself farther than ever before. And Guy, watching his students struggle against life and death, knew then what his father must have felt all those years ago. The helplessness of a teacher whose students had stepped into the fire and could no longer be shielded. In the time that followed, Guy grew even closer to Kakashi. Their rivalry matured into something that transcended the word. Though they would still challenge each other to eating contests or stare-offs, their quiet conversations spoke volumes. Guy would joke loudly about their eternal rivalry, and Kakashi would roll his eyes. But both men knew the truth. They had come to respect each other, not just as ninja, but as friends. They had fought in different ways, lived by different philosophies, but stood on the same ground when it mattered most. And then the world changed. The Akatsuki moved more boldly. Pain attacked the Hidden Leaf Village, destroying much of what had been built. Guy and his team were away on a mission at the time, and when they returned to see the destruction left in the wake of Pain's wrath, Guy's usually unshakable spirit trembled with guilt. He wasn't there. He hadn't been able to protect them. He stood in the rubble of Konoha, fists clenched, the wind tugging at his jumpsuit. Around him, villagers mourned, buildings crumbled, and fire still smoldered in broken homes. For a moment, Guy was silent. And then, slowly, he began to lift debris, brick by brick, plank by plank. Without words, without theatrics, he worked alongside villagers, soldiers, children. He carried the weight of the village on his back without ever saying it out loud. That was how he made peace with his absence, by building something new from what had been lost. But peace was fleeting, and the fourth great ninja war began. The shinobi world unified, not out of trust, but necessity. Guy was appointed as a leader of one of the Allied Shinobi Forces divisions, a testament to his strength, but also to the deep trust others placed in him. He did not hesitate. He led with courage, charging into battle not for glory, but for every student, every comrade, every villager who had ever believed in him. During the war, Guy faced some of the most dangerous opponents the world had ever known. He battled white Zetsu clones, ancient reanimated shinobi, and even faced Madara Uchiha, reborn with godlike power. And yet, through all of it, Guy never wavered. He protected his comrades, led from the front, and reminded everyone that spirit mattered just as much as strength. But something else began to take root during the war, a seed of finality. Guy had always known he was different. He had no flashy bloodline, no secret jutsu passed down from a hidden clan. His greatest weapon was his own body, and the 8 inner gates, a forbidden technique that allowed a person to push their body far beyond its limits, at the cost of their life. It was not a trump card. It was a sacrifice, a final, irreversible act of defiance. Guy never spoke of it, but he carried that decision with him like a sealed letter. He had trained not just for glory or for missions, but for the day he might need to become a shield. He knew his time might come, and as Madara Uchiha's power grew, threatening to crush the Allied forces under the weight of a single will, Guy began to see the outlines of his fate. The way his father had once stood against the 7 ninja swordsmen of the mist. The way Lee now stood with unwavering resolve in the battlefield. The way the world needed time to breathe. Time Guy might be able to buy. But that day had not yet come. Not quite. Not yet. He still had more to give. The war raged on like a thunderstorm without end, crashing through the lands with a fury that left mountains weeping and forests scarred. Might Guy stood at its heart, not as a general barking orders from the rear, but as a man of the front line, dirt on his brow, and resolve in his gaze. Each battle blurred into the next, and though exhaustion crept into the bones of many, Guy remained like a pillar against the tide. He kept the morale of his unit high, often with his loud voice, exaggerated poses, and challenges to see who could do the most one-armed push-ups between skirmishes. But beneath all that, he was watching, calculating. The burden he carried was becoming heavier by the day. The enemy's strength continued to escalate. Zetsu clones swarmed the battlefield like locusts, while legendary shinobi, long dead, returned under the control of Kabuto's reanimation jutsu. Each fight became a lesson in endurance. Guy faced former heroes and villains of history brought back against their will, their faces emotionless, yet familiar. These weren't the kinds of opponents you could defeat with just strength. They tested the mind. They tested the heart. But Guy never faltered. Each punch he threw was a declaration. I am still here. We are still fighting. You will not break us. He moved like fire, across the battlefield, flashing green, the sound of his kicks like distant thunder. Alongside Kakashi, he took on wave after wave, the two of them fighting not only with jutsu and taijutsu, but with complete synchronicity. For all their differences, the battlefield proved their connection. They trusted each other, without hesitation. When Guy struck high, Kakashi moved low. When Kakashi fell back to strategize, Guy held the front with the determination of a man who would not let his rival down. And in those stolen moments between battle, Guy would sometimes stand alone, eyes turned to the distant horizon, and think of Lee, of how far the boy had come, of how much he had surpassed his own pain and doubt. Lee was not a boy anymore. He was a shinobi, a warrior, and Guy, even amidst war, felt a warmth in his chest every time he saw him in action. He didn't need to guide Lee anymore. He simply needed to be there, like a lighthouse in a stormy sea, not moving, but always seen. It was in these moments of reflection that Guy remembered his father, Dewey, the eternal Genin, who had once died so that his son could live. Guy had long since forgiven the world for laughing at his father. He no longer felt the need to prove anything, but he did carry one thing still, the lesson of absolute conviction. Dewey had taught him that courage wasn't about strength. It was about choice. The choice to rise even when you're afraid, to smile even when it hurts, to stand even when you're alone. And it was this conviction that carried Guy into the final stages of the war. As the Shinobi Alliance closed in on the source of the enemy's power, the true puppet masters revealed themselves. Obito, the once hopeful Uchiha, who had become twisted by grief, and Madara, the ghost of a fallen legend, clawing his way back into godhood. The scale of the battle became unimaginable. Mountains shattered. The air itself seemed to crack under the pressure of chakra. And the battlefield turned into a theater of myths. Guy fought with every ounce of strength he had left. He pushed his body beyond normal limits again and again. And each time, the price became more apparent. He felt it in his joints, in the slow ache of his muscles, in the sharpness of every breath. But he didn't slow down, because each second he bought, someone else could regroup. Someone else could survive. And then, Madara. The name had always been a shadow, spoken in history, feared in legend. But now he stood before them in flesh and form, wielding power that dwarfed imagination. The Alliance's strongest jutsu faltered before him. He was not just strong, he was inevitable. And it became clear that if no one stepped forward to stall him, he would bring the end not just of the shinobi, but of the world itself. Guy knew. Deep inside, in that silent place where warriors hear the voice of fate, he understood. This was the moment he had trained for. This was what all those years of sweat and tears and perseverance had led to. His role was not to live forever, but to give others a chance to. He exchanged a quiet glance with Kakashi, who, without words, understood. And Guy made his decision. The 8th gate, the gate of death. He had never used it before. He had always hoped he would never have to. But he had memorized every motion, every inner path. As he began the process, the air around him shifted. His body turned crimson. Steam rose like mist from a boiling sea, and his heartbeat thundered like a war drum. His life was now a fuse burning toward the end. But what brilliance it would cast before it was gone. Lee screamed for him to stop, to wait, to find another way. But Guy only smiled, teeth bright, tears in his student's eyes, reflected in his own. "This is my time," he said. "This is the flame of youth, burning at its brightest." And then he launched forward. The instant Might Guy opened the 8th gate, the world around him seemed to pause, not out of reverence, but from sheer awe. The air warped with the pressure of his unleashed chakra, turning to steam that hissed and screamed with each pulse of his heart. His skin flushed a deep red, muscles pulsing with unnatural power. Every beat of his heart was a countdown now, and with each one, he stepped closer to death. But for Guy, there was no hesitation. His eyes glowed with that same fire that had carried him through a lifetime of hardship and belief. This was not the end. This was the moment he had always trained for. He moved like lightning forged in flesh, crossing distances faster than even the Sharingan could track. The ground cracked under the pressure of his footfalls. Rocks vaporized in his wake. And Madara, so calm, so arrogant in his newly gained godhood, was caught off guard for the first time. Guy landed a kick with such force that it bent space around it, twisting the very fabric of chakra. Madara was sent flying, his body rattling from the sheer pressure. He laughed, blood trickling from his mouth, not because he found it amusing, but because he was truly impressed. "This is taijutsu at its finest," Madara said, a grin on his face. "You are the strongest, no doubt." Guy didn't answer. He didn't have to. His fists did the speaking. His kicks were sermons. Each strike was a hymn sung from the soul of a man who never gave up, who never accepted limitations, who defied fate with every breath. Lee and Kakashi could only watch, tears in their eyes, their hearts pulled between admiration and anguish. To see their friend, their mentor, their rival, lay down everything without a second of regret. It tore at something deep. But they also knew this was always who Guy had been. And even now, as his body began to crumble under the pressure, he fought with grace, like a dancer atop the battlefield, spinning death into beauty. With the technique known as evening elephant, Guy unleashed a barrage of concentrated air pressure punches, each heavier than the last. The sound it made was thunderous, echoing across the battlefield like a war cry. Even Madara, with all the power of the Sage of Six Paths, began to show signs of strain, his armor cracking, his body bending under the onslaught. But Guy wasn't finished. He rose into the sky, a blur of crimson and will, preparing his final move, the Night Guy. A technique so devastating, it would burn what little life remained from his body into pure force. As he descended like a falling star, his body twisted and became a singular point of energy. The world seemed to tilt beneath the pressure. His kick landed with apocalyptic power, warping Madara's very body, bending his form and spirit alike. The ground shattered. The heavens roared. And then silence. Guy collapsed, steam rising from his form like smoke from cooling embers. His body was broken, burned from the inside out. His heartbeat slowed. His breath faded. And the light behind his eyes began to dim. But even as life began to leave him, he smiled. He had done it. He had fulfilled the promise of his youth. He had stood against the impossible. And for a moment, he had bent godhood itself. The battlefield fell silent. Kakashi ran to his side. Lee screamed, tears streaming down his face. "You can't die, Sensei! You can't!" And then, a miracle. Naruto, now touched by the power of the Sage of Six Paths, arrived just in time. Placing his hand over Guy's chest, he pushed the light of life back into him. Slowly, the steam began to subside. Guy's breathing, though faint, returned. The damage could not be reversed. His body would never move the same again. But he was alive, broken, but breathing, spared from death by a thread. Madara rose too, though bruised and battered. He acknowledged Guy with something rare, a look of respect. "You almost killed me," he admitted. "If you had landed that attack just a little closer to my head, it might have ended differently." And that was no small compliment. It was an acknowledgement that Might Guy, a man who had never used ninjutsu or genjutsu, had stood toe-to-toe with a god. Guy's consciousness drifted in and out. He was weak, his limbs no longer obeying him. But in his mind, he felt no regret. He had given everything. And even as the world pressed on toward the final climax of the war, with Naruto and Sasuke rising to take the mantle of destiny, Guy's heart was at peace. He had protected what mattered. He had shown the world what taijutsu, what the will of youth, could truly achieve. And in doing so, he had etched his spirit into the fabric of shinobi history. The days that followed the Great War moved like ripples across a still lake, quiet, solemn, yet charged with unspoken meaning. The battlefield was silent now. The skies no longer bled red. And for Might Guy, whose body now rested in the hospital under the gentle lull of steady breath and monitored rhythm, the war was over. But in truth, a new one had only begun. The battle of recovery, the confrontation with the stillness after a storm. Guy could no longer walk. The medical experts had done what they could. Naruto's divine intervention had snatched him from the jaws of death, but it could not restore what had been burned away by the eighth gate. Muscles that once pulsed with might now hung limp and lifeless. Nerve endings, once crackling with energy, no longer responded to his indomitable will. For a man who had always expressed himself through movement, this was a quiet devastation. But Guy did not rage against it. He faced this new chapter with the same radiant smile, the same loud declarations of perseverance, the same gleam of passion in his one remaining eye. "It's just another youthful challenge," he would proclaim, even as Lee quietly adjusted his chair, even as pain stabbed through what was left of his lower spine. "And I, Might Guy, will show the world that youth never gives up." Lee visited every day, and sometimes twice. He would bring his training reports, updates on the Genin squad he was now mentoring, and he'd sit at Guy's side, eyes shining with admiration and sorrow. He couldn't hide it all the time. His guilt for being unable to join Guy on that battlefield, his helplessness watching his eternal rival and sensei now confined to a chair. But Guy always sensed it. "Don't mourn me, Lee," he would say, with a firm pat on the arm. "Celebrate me. I burned brightly, and I am still here. As long as we draw breath, we can still shape the world." And he meant every word. Guy's hospital room became a gathering place for inspiration. Shinobi from across the villages came to pay respects, not out of pity, but reverence. Veterans who had fought in the war, young Chunin with dreams in their hearts, even Tsunade herself, each of them stopped by. Some to thank him, others to learn from him, and many simply to witness the unshakable spirit that had withstood a god. There was even a quiet moment when Kakashi stood at the foot of Guy's bed, hands in his pockets, mask still covering half his face, and simply said, "You won, you know?" Guy blinked, turning his head toward his eternal rival. "Huh? What do you mean?" Kakashi smiled beneath the mask, his one visible eye closing with warmth. "Our contest. You won. That final move. There's nothing I can do that could ever top that." There was silence for a moment. Then Guy burst into laughter, loud, brash, echoing laughter that filled the sterile walls with life. "Kakashi, you sentimental sap. I didn't win anything. We both burned together, didn't we?" Kakashi didn't argue. He didn't need to. In the world of eternal rivals, some things didn't need to be spoken aloud. Eventually, Guy was released from the hospital. His wheelchair had been reinforced to handle his spontaneous outbursts and energetic flails. He trained his upper body relentlessly, turning his rehabilitation into yet another mission. If I can't kick, then I'll punch twice as hard. If I can't run, I'll roll with style, he declared, wheeling down Konoha's roads like a comet in green. The village adored him. Children waved and saluted. Merchants offered him discounts. Parents pointed and told their kids stories of how this man once stood against Madara Uchiha himself. And Guy, humble and vibrant, received it all with humility and joy. But perhaps the most touching moments were those shared quietly, away from the spotlight. On clear mornings, Lee would wheel him to the top of Hokage Rock, where the village lay spread before them in shades of gold and green. There, they would sit and speak, not always of battles or training regimens, but of dreams, of youth, of what it meant to live a life where you give everything and ask for nothing in return. Lee, Guy said one such morning, his voice steady and calm. Promise me something. Lee turned, alert. Anything, Sensei. Guy's gaze softened as he stared out over the rooftops. Never let the fire go out. In you, in the students you train, in this village, the world will always need that fire. Lee's fists tightened, and a tear slid down his cheek. I promise. Guy's journey was no longer measured by kicks or flips, but by the strength he gave to others. And in that, he remained undefeated. He was proof that the human spirit, when fueled by kindness, determination, and boundless youth, could surpass any limit. Time passed, as it always did, slowly smoothing even the sharpest edges of pain, like water carving a river through stone. For Might Guy, life after war became not a retreat from the world, but a new stage for his vibrant, irrepressible spirit. He had given all that he could, but he still had more to offer. Not through battle, not through high-flying kicks or explosive punches, but through presence, wisdom, and unwavering belief in others. His days were spent training the next generation, not in the punishing physical ways of old, but in lessons that rooted themselves deep in the heart. He would shout encouragements across the academy training field from his wheelchair, arms crossed, eye blazing. Your youth is your greatest weapon. Use it without hesitation. His words were carried on the wind like gospel, and the young ones drank them in like sunlight. Where once he had led by example in combat, now he led by the sheer strength of character. There were moments of quiet, too. Moments when the sky above Konoha was too beautiful to ignore, when even the most tireless heart needed to rest. Guy would roll to the old training grounds, the ones where he and Lee had once sparred until their limbs gave out. He would close his eyes and listen to the wind threading through the trees. And in that silence, he would remember his father, Might Dewey, the man the world had mocked, ignored, and forgotten. until he saved it. Guy thought often of his father's sacrifice. He thought about what it meant to give everything without ever seeking recognition. And in those long afternoons, when the village buzzed softly behind him and the sun cast golden light over the grass, Guy found peace in knowing he had carried that legacy farther than anyone ever expected. Sometimes he would speak to his father, not aloud, but in the soft spaces of his mind. They understand now, he would think. They know what you gave, and I made sure they'd never forget. Lee remained ever at his side. No longer the bumbling student, he had grown into his own legend. A man who had not only followed in his master's footsteps, but had carved his own path alongside them. The student who had once wept over his failures now taught others how to rise from theirs. And still, he bowed before his sensei every morning, offering not just respect, but love. "Sensei," Lee said one evening, as the stars blinked awake above the Hokage monument, "do you regret it? Using the 8th gate?" Guy chuckled, the sound rough and warm. "Of course not. Not even for a moment." Lee frowned gently. "Even if it meant never walking again? Even if—" Guy turned, meeting Lee's gaze with the full force of that famous grin. "Lee, my body may have slowed, but my spirit runs faster than ever. The 8th gate was never about dying. It was about protecting what matters. And it worked. We're here. You're here." He pointed toward the village, glowing with lantern light in the night. "That's what I fought for. That's what I'd give everything for again." Lee wiped his eyes before they could betray him. In time, Guy began writing. Not for fame, not even for history, but for the young. Simple books with loud titles like 100 Rules of Youthful Living or Kicking Your Way to Inner Peace. They were absurd, joyful, and surprisingly heartfelt. Children loved them. Adults read them in secret. And across the villages, the legend of Might Guy grew not just as a warrior, but as a philosopher of optimism. His story rippled outward. He received letters from children in distant lands, from shinobi who had lost limbs in battle and found hope in his resilience, from widows and orphans who found comfort in his unshakable smile. He answered every single one. And when Boruto Uzumaki, the son of the 7th Hokage, began his own shinobi path, it was Guy who gave him a quiet lesson no one else could. You'll grow up in peace, but peace is not the absence of hardship. It's the courage to build something that lasts. Your father lit the way. Make sure you carry the torch. Years passed. Guy aged like the stone of Hokage rock, weathered but proud, unchanged in essence. He never stopped laughing, never stopped cheering on others, never stopped being the man who once stared death in the face and kicked it with everything he had. When his time finally came, and it did, gently, like a final breath at sunset, it was not marked by fanfare or ceremony. It was a quiet passing in his sleep, a smile still resting on his lips, a copy of one of his training scrolls clutched in his hands. He left behind no regrets, only stories, only hearts forever marked by his presence. Kakashi visited the grave often, though he rarely said much. He would stand there in silence, hands in his pockets, and whisper, "You finally got ahead of me again, Guy." Then he would chuckle, turn away, and vanish into the breeze. Lee, now older and wiser, tended the memorial with reverence. He built a small training ground beside it, a place where students could come and learn, just as he had once learned. There, every child was told of Might Guy, not just the warrior, but the man who turned disadvantage into inspiration, who showed the world that the fire of youth never dies. It only spreads. And when those children asked if the stories were true, if a man in green had really faced a god and smiled through the flames, the answer was always the same. Yes, he did.